The American South, for all intents and purposes, is the cradle of rock and roll. Memphis, Tennessee, for example, is often cited as rock and roll's ground zero. In the 1920s, it was a stopping point for black sharecroppers heading north, and musicians honed in on the blues and gospel on Beale Street. Over the next 2 decades, Southern folks would marry these styles to spur rhythm and blues, and all you had to do to make rock and roll was to throw in a little bit of country and hillbilly folk. And virtually all the proto-rock stars were from the South. Little Richard from Georgia, Fats Domino and Jerry Lee Lewis from Louisiana, Elvis, everybody's favorite appropriator, from Mississippi, or just generally below the Mason-Dixon line, be it Buddy Holly from Texas or Chuck Berry from St. Louis. But we all know by now that rock and roll wouldn't be contained to just the South. Sure, rock and roll has since become a global phenomenon, but its roots and some of its major transformations and commercial successes happened in America's coastal cities. San Francisco would bear the fruit of its own sound with bands like the Grateful Dead, the Ramones popping out of the punk scene in New York City, and the grunge scene in Seattle seemingly changed music overnight with bands like Nirvana. This is all to say that there are cities across the United States with a rich and legitimate rock and roll history. But there's still one glaring question.
Why the hell is the Rock Hall in Cleveland?
What's up, dinguses? Being both an admirer of rock and roll and a native of Northeast Ohio, I have always had this immense sense of pride that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was in Cleveland. But in all seriousness, Clevelanders have a sinful amount of pride for their city. We can't stop putting up signs to remind us where we live, and we also support the Browns year in and year out despite dog shit contract signings. Despite this sinful level of pride that me and every other Clevelander has for their city, the Rock Hall being in Cleveland has always confused me since I was a little boy. Cleveland has long been branded as the home of rock and roll, and I guess that makes sense if you squint enough. But I can't help but to think that there are more deserved locations around the country like Memphis or New York City where the offices for the Rock Hall actually are. So as a Clevelander, I have the exclusive rights to question and criticize Cleveland, unlike the rest of the world. So come with me as we spend some time to dig in as to why exactly they put the Rock Hall in Cleveland, what the Rock Hall itself is like today, and what's in store for the Rock Hall's branding in the future. But before we do, don't forget to like and subscribe. Seriously, it is the easiest way to support me in making my silly ass little videos. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first and most common answer as to why the Rock Hall is in Cleveland is because a guy named Alan Freed lived here and he came up with the term. That's it. Bye. Diggity dog. Just kidding. There is more to Alan Freed. Alan Freed was a radio DJ in Northeast Ohio in the late 40s to early 1950s. In 1951, he started at WJW in Cleveland and began playing rhythm and blues songs on the radio. Now, playing rhythm and blues on the radio was nothing new, as there were lower-powered stations playing rhythm and blues, but they were directed at black populations. However, Alan Freed was one of the, if not the first radio DJ to play rhythm and blues on a major broadcast network. Alan Freed also had a way with words and used a lot of hip language that the younger adults listening to the radio were using. And by this time in rock and roll's history, rhythm and blues had already been intercepted with swing, country, jazz, folk. So it suited him to call this music rock and roll. He coined the term and made history. Except he didn't. Because the term rock and roll had already been used to describe music 9 years earlier. In 1942, a Billboard columnist used the term to describe upbeat rhythm and blues when writing about Sister Rosetta Tharpe's Rock Me.
But before this time, another year.
So let me get this straight. Alan Freed, a Cleveland DJ, played rock and roll on the radio like people did before him, and he called it rock and roll like people did before him. So Cleveland's the home of rock and roll? Can you see why this was always the lamest argument to me? We'll get into more of why this is just another example of what I like to call Cleveland cope, but Alan Freed does have a legitimate history in rock and roll. Greg Harris was a former director of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and was once quoted to say, "Freed's role in breaking racial barriers in the US pop culture in the 1950s by leading black and white kids to listening to the same music put the radio personality at the vanguard and made him a really important figure. Alan Freed, probably more than any other radio DJ, brought rock and roll into the mainstream where it found its white audience. This was kind of a foundational moment in desegregating America, and all of this led to Alan Freed hosting, by all accounts, the first rock and roll concert, the Moondog Coronation Ball. The attendance to the show was largely mixed race, and the attendants were so excited and jazzed up for the show that the event was canceled because a riot broke out before the first act was even over. Now that's some punk rock attitude, but enough to call Cleveland the home of rock and roll? I'm not buying it. Another argument that Cleveland tries to pass on to the rest of the world for its rock cred is the radio station WMMS. WMMS, otherwise known as The Buzzard, is one of the oldest radio stations still running and was one of the most influential in terms of taste-making. Between Alan Freed and WMMS, Cleveland was actually once seen as a city to look towards to new trends and influence, instead of just the mistake on the lake.
At least we're not Detroit! We're not Detroit!
WMMS's heyday brought many legendary acts onto its airwaves, including David Bowie, Bruce Springsteen, Roxy Music, and Rush. And on that last note, it is kind of hard to not overstate just how important WMMS was in getting new bands on the radio for the entire country. In his memoir titled The Buzzard, Inside the Glory Days of WMMS and Cleveland Rock Radio, John Gorman, former program director of WMMS, wrote that the station was sent Rush's debut album and that the band's managers prioritized the track In the Mood to play on air. However, the team at WMMS decided that their song Working Man would resonate a lot better with all the blue-collar workers that were in Cleveland at the time. Quote, Denny played it that evening. The phones went wild with immediate and unexpected reaction. Where did you get that new Led Zeppelin track? Could you imagine the scope of rock and roll, let alone all of Canadian popular music, had Cleveland not played Working Man? Also, I never thought of that track as one that sounded like Led Zeppelin, but now I can't unhear it, and I hate myself as a result. WMMS's authority as a leading voice in rock and roll trends and influence would continue as they won Rolling Stone's Best Radio Station of the Year 9 times in a row between 1979 and 1987. Except they cheated. You see, this award was a Rolling Stones Readers' Poll Award. And in February of 1988, the Cleveland Plain Dealer reported that staff members at WMMS had been stuffing the ballots in 1987 to hopefully get the station to win for a 9th year so it would have a chance to win for 10 years in a row. Lonnie Gronek, who was the WMMS GM at the time, had said that this had been going on for years. The station would go on to say in its defense that this was nothing more than a marketing strategy and was no different to what other stations had been doing all around the country. So let me get this straight. Again, Cleveland should own the right to be called the birthplace of rock and roll because a bunch of classic rock bands got their start on their airwaves, and the station itself cheated to become the best radio station in all the country? What the fuck? Finally, the third reason why Cleveland was chosen as the home of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is the simplest. Money. That's it. Bye. Diggity dog. But seriously, this is the most probable reason as to why Cleveland was chosen as the home of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Foundation as an entity has existed since 1983. It started in New York City a full 12 years before the museum itself would ever open its doors. They spent 3 years looking for a city to host the museum. Philly, because of the TV show American Bandstand and early rocker Bill Haley. Memphis, which the Rock Hall itself calls the birthplace of rock and roll. Detroit for Motown Records, and Cleveland. However, Cleveland had an edge over all those other cities despite not having the best argument. In 2 words, public endowment. The city of Cleveland pledged $65 million to aid in the construction of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, by and large more than any other city. In today's money, that is over $185 million. So on May 5th, 1986, it was announced that Cleveland would become the home of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And this news elated the residents of Cleveland. As more and more jobs left the city to go overseas, Cleveland was looking for ways to avoid being known as the mistake on the lake. You know, without releasing millions of balloons into into the air, causing ecological disasters that the city knew all too well about. And even though Clevelanders were really proud that the Rock Hall was in their city, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Foundation itself seemed to not care at all. As you may know, the induction ceremonies into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame are just star-studded concerts. Reason would have it that you'd host the event in the city where the museum where these acts would be enshrined, but that was certainly not the case. The first 7 induction ceremonies for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame happened in New York, but in 1993 they wouldn't happen in New York. They'd happen in LA. Cleveland, the supposed birthplace of rock and roll, would have its first induction ceremony in 1997 with acts like Paul McCartney, but they wouldn't see another induction ceremony for another 12 years as the ceremonies alternated between New York City and Los Angeles. It seems like the foundation knew that Cleveland wouldn't be able to preserve the shimmering glamour that the foundation needed for its self-serving image, so they kept it as far away as possible. Nowadays, the induction ceremonies do alternate between New York City and Cleveland, but even this had to be done with city and state money from Cleveland and Ohio, respectively. Hopefully by now you understand why I've felt that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame being in Cleveland has always confused me. But the counterpoint to that is, why not Cleveland? Fuck those coastal cities and their large market media. Here in the Midwest, we don't sell out, unless it's to get the Rock Hall. Then we sell out. We sell out big. When researching for this video, I knew I'd be absolutely remiss if I didn't take a trip to the Rock Hall myself, and that is exactly what I did. If you're from Cleveland or the surrounding area, you would get field trips to the Rock Hall almost every single year. So this was definitely not my first visit, but it was my first visit in a long, long time. The building itself is downright beautiful. It was designed by I.M. Pye, whose other work you may or may not recognize. Cleveland gets this pyramid building, and Memphis, the supposed home for rock and roll, gets this pyramid building. I guess everything's square in that regard by now. The museum itself has 6 floors of galleries and interactive exhibits displaying rock and roll's past and present. This was my first time in almost 10 years that I had gone to the Rock Hall, and they put in enough work since then for some new interactive exhibits like the Beat Lab honoring the 50th anniversary of hip-hop, and another exhibit where you could design and print your own band stickers and then place them wherever you wanted to around that section of the museum. And as someone who often goes to smaller rock venues, I really enjoyed this nod to a piece of rock culture. But there were a couple glaring omissions. When I was younger, the Beatles exhibit featured the original Sgt. Pepper uniforms, which people would rightfully gawk at. Now the Beatles exhibit just features these bobbleheads. Another big thing that I missed that wasn't there was the Michael Jackson exhibit where his famous bedazzled glove was set in a case of glass. Be that as it may, I still had an awesome time there. The hall also featured exhibits from future first ballot Hall of Famers such as Taylor Swift. And to that point, I'm doing a live stream series where I'm reacting to all of Taylor Swift's albums for the first time. If you'd be interested in watching that, go ahead and subscribe to check it out. Also, I noticed that you haven't liked the video yet. Okay. As of 2023, $100 million had been approved for an expansion that adds 10,000 square feet to the Rock Hall. This is more or less a part of Cleveland's effort to develop the lakefront. You know, like successful Great Lakes cities. It seems like the Rock Hall is going to be fine as an institution, but I'd be a sillier man than I am now if I didn't mention where exactly the branding's going to go for the Rock Hall in the future. Now, I don't listen to complaints about Madonna or Public Enemy being inside the Rock Hall because they're not rock. However you want to slice it, pop and hip-hop would not exist if it weren't for rock and roll. But as of the 2010s, rock as a genre just doesn't have the same cultural pull and clout that it once did. And no, I'm not some schlub who's going to tell you that music isn't good anymore because there's less rock. There's great rock out there, it's just not in our faces anymore. Things change. Get over it. But 10 years from now, how many legitimate rock artists will be inducted as opposed to hip-hop, R&B, and pop artists? Bands like Blink-182, the White Stripes, and the Black Keys have yet to be inducted, but what rock acts can they say deserve a place in the Rock Hall after them? I think we're looking at a future where the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame will have to change its name, maybe to the Music Hall of Fame. But at that point, where the hell does that leave Cleveland? Rock and roll now is a part of Cleveland's identity, and if you changed it to the Music Hall of Fame, what's stopping the museum from moving to another city like Nashville? Nashville's a city where there's a music scene on a grand scale. Not to say that Cleveland doesn't have a great music scene, it does, but I think we can all agree that it's not even in the same ballpark. So, what are your thoughts? Do you think that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame should have been hosted in another city? And what do you think is the future of the Rock Hall? And for that matter, rock music? Let me know in the comments down below. And as a reminder, go ahead and check out my community tab for the next time I'll go live. And I hope to see you there. So with that said, I've been Jerry Bees. You've been awesome. Take it easy.
Diggity dog. Breaking. Diggity dog.